Starting with lesson 14, we're going to look at the power of Jesus. Wonders that make you say, wow, and signs that make you say, oh, and then claims that just Jesus using a miracle to make a claim about his identity. So let's get started. Lesson 14, is Christianity boring? Now, I know that sounds like an awful question to ask, but listen, I grew up in a church where I would have said yes, yes, and yes. But when you compare a lot of the churches that we've been to the experience of being with Jesus, it wasn't boring at all. And his very first miracle, man, it was at a wedding. It was a celebration. And it was put there for a purpose. That actually Christianity begins with a call to a celebration. It's a wedding of sorts between the church and Jesus as the groom. And it's going to end in Revelation with a celebration, or I should say, our new beginning in the New Jerusalem will begin with another wedding celebration. So this is in the thick of what Jesus is calling us to. It begins in verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. The third day of what? Well, technically, it takes 3 days to get from Judea, where Jesus was, up to Cana, where the wedding was. So it could just refer to the 3-day journey. But you know Jesus better than that. 3 days is symbolic, and it makes us think, particularly since John wrote this book at the end of the first century. He has like 50 years of church history, actually more than 80 years of church history almost, to reflect on 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. That's the resurrection. So our very initial miracle reminds us of the coming resurrection. And the mother of Jesus, why is she there? Well, she's kind of like the matron of the wedding. It was a very honorable position to be in. And for a widow to be able to take charge of a public wedding would give her clout that's hard to come by. And it appears to me, since Joseph is never mentioned after this, he may have already died. And Jesus is already gone and has been gone for a while now, getting disciples. Mary's on her own. You know, maybe the younger brothers are helping out. I'm sure they were. But to gain clout and like social status, this is a rare opportunity for Mary, and it's about to go awry. Verse 2. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said, "They have no wine." Now, Mary's not technically asking for anything, but when a mother, particularly in the Middle East, mothers had a lot of power over their boys. And if she makes a suggestion, he should jump to it and meet the need, particularly since it is likely that they ran out of wine because Jesus brought 12 thirsty boys. And so it's a fair request. Here's Jesus' response, verse 4. "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." It's not rude, but it is curt. He doesn't call her mom, mother, but woman. And then he says, "My time is not yet come," which in John, the time of Jesus, that's mentioned multiple times, always refers to the crucifixion. I don't exactly know what he means, except when he says, what does this have to do with me? Literally, the Greek is, what to me to you? What to me to you? What business is this of mine? Here's what Jesus is getting at. When God the Father is calling him to move away from Nazareth, away from the family, to really to establish the kingdom, his mother, who is feeling maybe a little alone and maybe pressured by the wedding, is pulling him back into the family. So does Jesus obey his heavenly Father or his earthly mother? And in a way that only Jesus can, he does both at the same time. Here's the story. Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you've kept the good wine until now. And then the conclusion, because Jesus just done this miracle, it's not just a miracle. In fact, John doesn't give miracles. John gives signs. It says in verse 11, this was the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and the disciples believed in him. For John, whose gospel is all about the evidence of the signs. Think of John 20:31. Many other signs or miracles Jesus did in the presence of many witnesses, but these have been recorded that you may believe in him, and by believing have life in his name. So, for a book that is based upon the evidence of miracles, isn't it strange that John only mentions 7? Actually, it's not strange. It's very, very Jewish. Because, as you probably know, Jews used numerology. That is, numbers had spiritual significance. And 7, being a product of 3, which is the divine number, and 4, the human number, it is God doing something in our midst. So it's appropriate to have 7 signs. And if you trace these signs from the beginning of the wedding through to the raising of Lazarus, you actually have the 7 steps of discipleship. We'll go through most of them in this study, but the beginning one, and this is why we ask the question, is Christianity boring? The beginning sign, the initial invitation, is to a wedding celebration. And if you look at the 3 days that began the question, you might think, well, I don't feel like I'm celebrating. I don't feel like my life is going particularly well. Maybe it's anxiety, or maybe it's stress, or maybe it's some kind of personal difficulty. That's where the 3 days comes in. There is a resurrection coming. You are invited to a wedding, but we have to wait the 3 days. When Jesus returns and we are resurrected, then you will see fully and finally at the marriage supper of the Lamb all that has been promised to you. In the meantime, let this be a sign that God is inviting you, not to some boring ritual, not to some heavy obligation, but to a wedding, and you get to be the bride.